Hi, everyone. It's really great to be talking with you all today. Specifically, this talk is going to be about incident response in unfamiliar socio-technical systems. As an incident commander, I'd like to share some of the challenges I've encountered in supporting interorganizational anomaly response during COVID-19. I'm a site reliability engineer at Salesforce. I focus on incident response, both as an incident commander as well as training other incident commanders. I help build our incident response framework, and I am a Sherpa guide for helping others learn from incidents. I am, however, the least interesting portion of this talk, so let's go ahead and get going. What I'm looking to cover at a very high level is an overview of the Incident Command System, or ICS. I've cherry-picked ICS because we've seen a decent amount of adoption of the system in the private sector within the last decade, especially within the tech industry. So I want to really talk about it at some length and give some detail about how it came to be and how it's evolved. From there, I want to talk about how it's been tuned, or how ICS has been tuned for private companies, how people tend to adopt and trim it to make it an effective mechanism in the enterprise space. Then we'll talk about the pandemic and some of the ways that's driven my engagement in more incidents and some of the drivers for that. And I'll go then about the challenges that I've been encountering as an incident commander working in unfamiliar organizations and assisting with that interorganizational support. Lastly, I want to take a few minutes to touch about learning from incidents. Now, there's a ton of literature on this and there are a ton of talks on it. And I want to not take too much time, but I do want to take a couple minutes to talk about how to help in learning at the very end of an incident when you have a chance to debrief each other. So as mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about the history of ICS, why it was created, and that'll give a really good idea of what the incident command system represents. Now, at a very high level, it's a leadership hierarchy structure, but that's kind of a boring way to describe it. So I want to talk about the genesis of ICS, and that really is at the in the 1960s. So we see in California during the 1960s a bit of a land boom, and as a result, adoption of land usage and rapid development of land. We see changes in watershed management. We see changes in agriculture, how fuel and industrial materials are stored. And as part of this, though, as all of this land is being aggressively rezoned, reused, and restructured, we don't necessarily see a lot of the same growth and rapid acceleration in systems that are meant to support land use, like fire protection. So as this land continues to be developed, there's more of an exposure risk to things like wildfires moving forward. When we get to 1970, there's a pretty devastating number of wildfires in a very short period of time. Specifically, within a 13-day period, we see 773 wildfires occur. It's a lot of wildfires. Unfortunately, 16 people died over this 13-day period. We see over 700 structures destroyed and 500,000 acres burned. Firefighters often had to deal with wildfires and large wildfires and a lot of wildfires in the past, but the number that they saw, just the sheer volume of fires in such a short period of time, was really difficult. And some of the challenges that they encountered as a result tend to stem from coordinating the responders and the associated report or support organizations. These teams and groups that would come together had different organizational structures. So they wouldn't necessarily be identical in terms of resources that were being brought, or personnel, or even the command structures tended to be different. As a result, there were difficulties once these teams started working with each other on planning. Once they got on scene, hey, what are we going to do? That interagency coordination was difficult because of the fact that they weren't necessarily familiar or positive about what each group was bringing to the table. That meant that joint planning was difficult. There were gaps in information, both how quickly they could get information to the table and whether or not it was accurate, because there was confusion on who was doing what, how you could get that joint activity going, and because the resources and responses were uncoordinated because of the problems I've gone over. This really culminated in a limited ability to predict or anticipate not only what people were doing, but what people were capable of doing. So after that fire season, a task force was created named FireScope, because we love acronyms, and FireScope was established to build what would eventually become ICS. They were really looking to build a system that would operate more effectively than the systems that were used in the past LFO, or large fire organization, if I remember that correctly. So the objectives were primarily around better communications and better resource management. When we talk about better communications, we are talking about a combination of terminology, common language, common usage, so people could understand what they were saying to each other, as well as common outreach strategies. How do I get a hold of you? How do I get a hold of your boss? How do we communicate to the state? How do we communicate to local and regional authorities? So on. Regarding resource management, they wanted to try to tackle the issues with organization that were identified. How do we know who's responding? Who do we know, or how do we know what resources we're bringing and who's responsible for organizing those resources? How do we maintain responsibility while still having some measure of organizational autonomy and be able to still be independent resources operating under a common goal? And how do we make sure that as we task these resources, that we understand not only what they can do, but what they're expected to do, and allow for objective-oriented management as part of that. Now, these objectives were great, but in terms of what else the solution needed to be flexible. It needed to be able to address not only the challenges they had encountered at this time in 1970, or even challenges that they'd seen in the past, but perhaps additional unforeseen catastrophes or emergencies. It needed to be repeatable. They didn't want to build a structure that was just rarely used, or were used just for the worst incidents or emergencies in the world. It needed to be something that could be used for routine day-to-day activity, not only to help get value out of it, but to help build expertise, familiarity, and to really make sure that there was muscle memory when people were utilizing this process. And because if you're going to have this many things that you want anyway, while you're at it, you might as well make it cheap, right? The solution, I know this will be a shock, turned out to be the Incident Command System, or ICS. This is really defined as a centralized leadership support structure, where you have a centralized leader, the incident commander, and then a cascading number of support staff and organizations that support the incident commander. Now, the support staff and support organizations start with the officer corps, who report directly to the incident commander and are the lieutenants of this organization. They help coordinate the rest of the response. And from there, that you see that you have subsequent sections. This is from an ICS 200 model, I believe, where you have the 5 sections of operations, planning, logistics, and finance and admin. That's 4, but 5 responsibilities. And you have these section chiefs there. And under these sections chiefs, you'll have branch directors, division supervisors, and it just continues to branch down until you get to individual contributors. And these section chiefs will work with the officers and the incident commander to help drive strategic guidance, tactical support, and broader delegation, as well as assist in bringing up reports back from each of the specific section branches about what's going on, what is needed, conditions, actions, and needs primarily. And this means that you have a hierarchy structure that can be trained. It's a logical structure, so that once a fire team responds, they know that there will be an incident commander, this officer corps, these section chiefs, and so on, as is needed during the incident. And this was what they built to solve the problems as identified. And we do see that the certain level of complexity that it just keeps that they keep expanding and building and tearing it down to try to make it manageable. Now, ICS has continued to evolve. It didn't just start with a base proposal for ICS, everyone win, it's great, and off we go. Three major points I want to highlight about evolution, because we do see adoption throughout the early 1980s. California is using it, Southwestern US is using it, but federal adoption and broader national and international adoption starts happening in the mid to late 80s. In the mid 80s, you see the 1985 Mexico City earthquake, and after that, the federal government decides to start utilizing ICS to help improve their international disaster response. You also see the military start adopting it, and the first major use of the military usage of ICS that I'm aware of is in 1989, when the Coast Guard responds to the Exxon Valdez disaster and helps assisting with the oil spill there. Most recently, you see a fundamental adoption and push for ICS-based systems through the National Incident Management System Framework, or NIMS. This was after the September 11th terrorist attack, where we see that many national, state, local, and private organizations all came together to try to help each other through the aftermath of the disaster. And there were challenges in not only communication, different radios, different frequencies as a classic example, but also in intelligence sharing. And not only secretive intelligence, but things like making sure everyone understood what the weather forecast was, so people could understand where there may be toxic metal residue or debris being blown in the air and things like that. So you see the establishment of a intelligence chief as an addition as part of NIMS, and this idea that you really need to structure for mutual aid. So NIMS really pushed for a standard of, if you're responding under the NIMS framework, that you have these compatible these compatible systems for this idea of mutual support. Now, as mentioned, we have seen ICS adopted within private companies and tech companies specifically in the last decade. Salesforce adopted it or a variant of ICS in 2012. I doubt we were the first people to do it. And in the last 5 or 6 years, it's really boomed and more companies are picking it up. So I want to mention that we have seen a decent amount of success with ICS in the tech industry. And I'll mention that Salesforce, since we've adopted it, we have seen improved incident response from our side. Talk a little bit about why. I think that it really keys into this idea of a repeatable framework. This helps build initial common ground prior to any anomaly response beginning, not only in terms of terminology or common language, but in familiarity with the people who are going to be that you're going to be responding and working with, because you can see who's getting trained, who's being adopted into these logical, we refer to them as wartime teams. And you start to really build familiarity on the people who show up as incident commanders, as triagers, as incident communications, and so on. Common ground's a big point, because you will see common language, common communications, and the ability to understand what people are talking about in terms of severity, signaling through things like incident severity, and understanding that you will have common terminology in things like internal and external communication. So people start to pick up the language of incident response. It makes it easier to talk about it. You also see a push for the sort of rigor that ICS provides because of increased system criticality. Now, I'd originally talked about this as system complexity, but I don't really think that's as much the case, because our systems have always been complex. I think we're just getting better at recognizing it. So it's really a matter of criticality because of how customers and users are coming to use our systems. I remember in 2013, Richard Cook at Velocity mentioned that the future of our systems are invariably going to be tied to safety critical instead of mission critical services. And like some twisted monkey's paw curse, I've been spending the better part of a decade watching it come true. ICS is also useful as a framework because it allows predefined signals and conditions. You can train on expected behavior. You can train on chain of command. You can train that if you do see a code red or a severity 3 or a Mountain Dew or whatever it is, that you understand what behavior should occur, what your response should be. If there's an escalation, what the escalation should be. It's a framework for all this predefined response. Now, is ICS the only framework that you could possibly use to manage incidents? Of course not. There are plenty of other ones that could be used, and I have no doubt that they could be successful. ICS is appealing, especially from a private company perspective, because it allows a good sensation of delegation of authority and an understanding of how an incident evolves and scales. ICS within the private enterprise, though, does tend to look a little different from public ICS. I've put up in the corner there a base model of the incident management system that Salesforce implements. And you can see that there's still an incident commander. You can see that there's still this branch immediately of these officers, the TAD officer, triage and diagnosis, the incident documentation officer, and so on, that still report to the IC. But you'll also notice that the section chiefs generally don't exist in this model. And it's because when you look at something like how Salesforce has implemented ICS, those section operations, actually the responsibilities there tend to get merged in at the officer level. So you start to, and Salesforce isn't the only organization that does this. So you start to see that the ICS framework is often scaled down, and that specific goals that we're looking for within IMS, or some of the goals that ICS specifies, tend to dominate. The examples I'll give are common terminology, integrated communications, and management by objective actually tend to be three really big things that you'll see in private enterprise ICS, but you don't necessarily see people worry about finances. How much is it costing to run this incident? Now, that certainly will be discussed at some point, but it's usually not during the incident itself, or how much money do we need to respond. Not saying that never happens in the private sector, but I'm saying that it is unusual to see something like that. There are also different scaling expectations, which is part of the reason that we do tend to see these mergers and trim downs occur. And the reason for that is because we see this idea of static and predefined role expectations. Because we know where usually the TAD will be coming from, where the incident documentation officer will be coming from, the incident commander. These are static resource pools, and we otherwise expect a more dynamic outreach or branching out once we get to the subject matter experts and other delegation needs. So when we talk about logistics planning and operational delegation, that's all composed to the incident commander and the immediate ICS or core roles. And then dynamic roles tend to be based on what broke or what we're responding to, whether or not it's a certain application, if it's a database stack, things like that. Another thing to note here is that mutual aid usually is not a major focus. When ICS is implemented at a company like Salesforce, we will take IMS and go, this is exactly how we've implemented it. Look at how we did it. Here are our roles. This is great. Everyone should use it. And people will look, go, that's pretty cool. They'll take the framework and they'll go, I like this. Let's take it for our organization. Let's adjust this. Let's take these roles. I'm not sure we want to staff it like this. You start to see very specific modification of ICS, because of the same way that when Salesforce initially adopted it, we went, here's what we need for our needs. Great. Let's see others within the company use it in their organizations and services. That they went, great. They took it and started doing the same thing. They started molding and saying, what roles do we really need? What processes are we trying to kick off? What are we trying to support through incident response? And as a result, you actually start to get these little multi-siloed ICS structures, which isn't necessarily a problem out the gate, because you have these different response teams with the expectation that they will be handling this product or this service, or this site reliability team will be responsible for this sphere of influence, and they can operate incidents how they go. And you'll have this SRE team over there, and they'll handle it. However, Remember what ICS was meant to do, or one of the things that ICS was meant to do, and eventually accumulated in this idea of mutual aid? As you're tweaking these responses, you start to see that your ability to rapidly assist each other will start to break down because these expectations and this initial common ground starts eroding. So when teams do start interacting with each other during incident response, there can be complications, which is really what I'm going to be talking about for the next few minutes. So since the pandemic began, I've been significantly more engaged with interorganizational incident response, both as an incident commander and also as a supporting resource to other incident commanders who are working in interorganizational response. The main drivers that have led to me having the specific exposure and change in behavior, and I suspect will be familiar to a lot of people who are supporting technology during the pandemic, is the uneven and massive usage spike that we've seen on certain services. Ones that I've often seen involve remote work platforms and web commerce products. And we will also see across the industry some services that actually see a reduction in usage as offices are shuttered, as people are sent to work remotely. You'll see that balance and adjustment in what systems are seeing increased usage and which ones are dropping down. The challenge with that is that the response teams who are handling a lot of incidents, if there are a lot of incidents, not that any company has a lot of incidents, but if there are a lot of incidents, you see that not necessarily the teams who are used to handling the bulk of the incidents are now the ones who are handling the new influx of incidents. Teams that are familiar with handling a large volume of incidents at that time can often be asked to assist teams that are under new pressure, either because the traditional amount of incidents led to a certain staffing or scaling expectation, and this explosion means they need additional help. It can be that they're used to handling incidents, but there are now just so many of them that they just need warm bodies. So there may be an ask for personnel and additional incident commanders to assist with that. There's also a huge amount of additional pressure because, of course, incidents weren't pressurized enough to begin with around the customer demands on incidents being solved rapidly, especially for these mission and safety critical systems that are now being heavily utilized. If you're working remotely and you're isolated in quarantine and you're unable to put in an order for medicine, that can be a problem. If I'm unable to get orders in for groceries and I'm running low, that can be a problem. And it's a reasonable expectation that you'd want the system brought back online quickly. Customer patience is not what it used to be. And because customer patience is not what it used to be, especially in these systems, it means my boss's patience may occasionally not be what it used to be either. And of course, I know no one knows exactly what I'm talking about there. So when you look at the sort of adjustments you have, hey, let's give them some experience. They'll be able to adapt. They're learning. Let's get some new people in and start training them up. There's less patience in baking in a team for response or kind of organically growing that capacity. You really look at how can we bring it in now? And that leads to me, because I'm an experienced incident commander. I've been running incidents for close to a decade for Salesforce and close to 20 years since I stumbled into this profession. So an experienced incident commander will absolutely magically fix all challenges in another organization's incidents, right? Right? And this is what I'll refer to as the warm blanket fallacy, so named because when an experienced incident commander is brought in for an incident, it makes executives and other personnel involved feel better. It's like a warm blanket has been draped over their shoulders. It's this feeling of security. And the warm blanket fallacy is an experienced incident commander does not guarantee flawless results in unfamiliar environments. I'm living proof. I could certainly be effective if I'm dropped in cold, but it won't be necessarily because I've run 8 million incidents and by golly, my firm command is going to be what gets us there. I'm still going to have to figure out the common patterns in an incident, behaviors about how people are responding, whether or not they're confident, where there are common ground breakdowns and things like that. I can't really do a lot of that effectively, and especially repeatably, without some sort of shared understanding of not only what's expected when I go into that incident, but what's required in terms of supporting that organization for incident response. That leads to really one of the first things that you need to think about and tackle when you are put in to this sort of situation. Again, not that anyone but me ever has been there, but you need to think about what we do to support these organizations, especially when they're unfamiliar socio-technical systems. There's no easy answer, but there are occasionally simple ones. A simple one I'll highlight out the bat: you want to establish a support agreement ahead of time. If you're finding out that you need to support the organization when you're asked for an incident commander, you're kind of already a couple of steps behind of where you need to be. There's no free lunch when it comes to addressing these, and it's important to establish a joint of agreement as to what the ICO or ICS roles and processes are expected to look like and what will be in use when that incident commander shows up. An easy example I'll give is I was brought into an incident for an organization. I was briefed as to what was happening. I asked whether or not we had posted externally and got confirmation that they were waiting for the incident commander to make the call. I said to our communications officer, let's go ahead and do it. Let me know when it's done. I get a reply, well, I don't actually do that in our organization. It's support who does that. And go, okay, do we have support on the line? No, we don't. So there are actually a few different challenges here that immediately pop up. Should support be on the line already? I don't actually know this, or whether or not we're expecting that to be an escalation. Do I know what the actual communications officer should be doing or shouldn't be doing? If they're not posting externally, does that mean my other expectations about internal communications, outreach, partnership, and wording, are those off? I now lack and a fundamental understanding of what this communications officer is meant to do. I probably have some idea because they probably haven't rewritten it entirely to what I'm familiar with, but it does mean that I'm on uneven enough ground that my mental model is now untrustworthy. And my mental model of what a communications officer does is completely different from theirs. This also impacts the ability for me to initiate action and engagement, and actually makes it really difficult to go, well, what else should I be tasking these individuals to do, just in case the roles that they're assigned may not be the ones responsible for that? And there may be times where people are able to take care of actions, whether or not it's their responsibility, and they'll be willing to do it. But part of the reason you build a framework around something like ICS or the incident command system is so that you have that understanding, that common ground, and that mental model to say, look, I know that Janet is the incident commander. I know as the incident commander what her responsibilities are. I know what her authority is. And I know that she's going to delegate and be the person that I need to talk to if I'm providing technical support. I know that as a communications officer, if I'm expected to perform that role, I'm responsible for internal communications, external communications, so on. All of this goes out the window if you don't have that understanding of the ICS model. And so the support framework sets those expectations, what not only what the roles are required or what roles are required in the process for success there, but also setting expectations and the ability to predict, once I show up in your environment, what I need to do and what resources I need to be able to do that. One other note, just as a side, if you are supporting a different organization or engaging in an organizational response, and it's using a video bridge as a command center, insist on webcams. Absolutely, really try. Webcams help a lot in recovering some of the loss and signal detection that you get with interacting with each other physically. And because you're working with people that you may not be familiar with, and in fact, very likely not familiar with, especially working in a pressurized environment like an incident, losing that signal loss can make it really hard to pick up some cues as when things are going on. So establishing a support agreement lays the initial common ground for future joint activity. When it comes to common ground, love it, nurture it, do everything you can to build common ground. Now, the challenge is that building common ground remotely as an incident commander with working with people that you are unfamiliar with is exceedingly tricky to do. It's difficult to build it, it's difficult to maintain it. There's some tricks you can do, but some of them do have trade-offs or downsides. One that I'll highlight off the ground is that you can build common ground by asking for updates. Can you give me information? Because you're asking for that information, it's being presented to you as the incident commander, and other people on the response team will be able to hear or see this information being provided. However, you're interrupting someone when you're asking for that. You're increasing signal noise at that point, and you may be interrupting critical work as a result, but you still need to get information. As the incident commander, you can't just sit there and wait for someone to tell you when they're ready to tell you something. Utilize time boxing as a way to potentially help kind of mitigate disruptive inquiries and to assist others in setting their own information and update schedules. Time boxing is this idea that as an incident commander, I'll reach out and say, hey, I need this critical bit of information. Can I get it in 5 minutes? Or you can ask, when should I expect an update by? You're still interrupting to get that information, but you're also allowing them to dictate what their communication schedule will look like, and you can coordinate the rest of the response around that. This also, again, continues to help mitigate the disruptive loop of asking, are we there yet? Repeatedly, which is something that I have seen more often than I would like to admit. As an incident commander, I want to ask about what critical information is. I have a bad habit of wanting to know everything, and that's not really a good way to go. What I really should be doing is asking, what do I need to know? And being able to say, hey, this is Morgan Collins, I'm the IC, what's going on? I can get an update. There have been times where I'll just ask, what do I need to know right now? And then someone may, oh, then give me that critical information, but also makes it cheaper because people are already listening and helping assist and process that information. So asking for that really helps. As an incident commander, I really want to spend a lot of time monitoring for coordination or communication breakdowns as a way of helping build common ground. As stated, this really is harder to do when working with people that you are not necessarily familiar with, or that we don't have context for the nuanced signal, but there are ways to check for it. You can look for it in how people answer. You for sounds of confusion. Short answers are always a great sign that there is a potential communication or coordination breakdown. And even the lack of an answer, which is my personal favorite, hey, this is Morgan, can I get an update on X? Crickets. You also want to acknowledge information. When someone gives you an update, make sure that you represent acknowledgement in such a way that it's clear you understood it. If I hear someone provide a significant technical update and they ask if the other person got it, and the other person replies, okay, I have a pretty good idea that that information wasn't actually processed. In situations like that where you're unsure if there's a gap between mental models, you want to make sure the data was interpreted properly if at all possible. Asking for a repeat of the data can be detrimental to your signal to noise ratio, but it may be worth it just to verify that someone is not running off with a completely different mental model than what was expected. Decentralized command. You really want to look at empowering others as an incident commander to make recommendations and decisions when necessary. I can become a bottleneck if I'm spending too much time figuring out what's going on and what I think needs to happen. If I get other people to assist in telling me what the pertinent information is, what actions do we need to take, especially from a technical standpoint. I, as an incident commander, should never be troubleshooting a technical system. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a habit of trying. You want to enable independent operations that allow for people to leverage their expertise, especially when you do have people who are familiar and experts in the socio-technical system that you're working with. So emphasize that if there's a need for a decision or confirmation about a decision or choice being made, to go ahead and call it out to the incident commander, but you really want to push that out. You also want decentralized command because it allows more data processing to happen from the broader response team. Too much information directly to the incident commander will distract them from serving as a support and coordination actor. There are limits to how much I can process. There's a limit to how much anyone can process, and it can lead to breakdowns in the response. Information overload also makes it harder for me to integrate the data, leading to incorrect signal detection and mental models. If I do have to process information, think about what I said earlier. I just need to ask for what's highly critical data and then determine what to do with that from there, rather than try to determine what is and is not valuable. We are nearing the end of our time together. I do want to take a couple minutes at the end here to talk about early learnings and incidents and how we could use immediately after an incident to grow a little insight, especially when looking at unfamiliar systems and working with people that you're just starting to work with. A lot of incident analysis will generate great and meaningful insights, but there is benefit to talking, especially as a ICS response team, immediately after the end of an incident. It's easier to compare mental models of what happened. Now, some analysts will say that this is actually a bit of a headache because it means you're aligning mental models before the analyst can get and interview the responders, which can hamper their ability. Well, not significantly hamper, but it can change the outcomes of the analysis. And that is true, but especially when a team's not used to working with each other, I think the trade-off's worth it, to be able to discuss what happened, compare critical decisions, and compare what knowledge was had during the time, how familiar people were with what was going on, and to discuss some of the decisions, especially if there were potential areas of contention, not that that ever happens, disagreement, things like that, because by comparing side by side these disagreements and contrasting them and these decisions that are being made, the responders are able to literally do the math of how everyone came to their decisions or made their decisions. So as an incident commander, if I thought taking a certain action was the right way to go and said, hey, let's do X, and someone who isn't the incident commander but is very experienced in the system or organization that I'm not pops up and says, hey, no, we should do this instead, I may ask briefly for why. I may get an answer and I'll go, okay, you know what? That sounds right. Let's go ahead and do that. I support that action. After, though, I could sit there and really dig in and go, well, here's what didn't make sense to me. Here's why I thought when I said go do X, that was the right decision. And in turn, the SME or expert could sit there and go, well, here's why I recommended Y. And I could literally see the difference in the decision paths. It also gives a chance for people to just call out where they saw good performance. A lot of the time, we see people are kind of having tunnel vision during the incident. There may be bottlenecks in their attention. They may literally be just so focused they're not seeing the broader response. As an incident commander, you can call out kudos, you can call out challenges, but it's really good to identify, hey, here's where we did well, here are opportunities that we think we may be able to excel. And by bringing up those events, you can also do the math, talk about what led to the challenge, or how we perceive those challenges at that time and how we responded to them then. Also, discussing about observations like these and the perceived cues, like, did you have trouble here, or it seemed like you were struggling at this time, I heard hesitation in your voice. It helps you train to pick up new cues or signals from personnel that you're working with. By learning how people actually understand and interpret your reactions, it's easier to clarify and understand how they work and be able to kind of understand not only the signals of their intent in the future, but for them to understand you and how you operate. So to wrap this all up, ICS is a great start, but it's not the cure-all. You don't just install ICS and everything is good. It is something that you can utilize for interorganizational response, but you have to make sure that you align your ICS processes in such a way that people can interact with each other. I talked a decent amount about coordination over command. I'll highlight that that continues to be a broad theme. And I think that sharing experiences and after action reviews will continue to help grow familiarity with working with each other, and it will make it easier for people to collaborate in the future. Thank you very much, and I will be around in the Slack channel for a while in case anyone has any questions.